and good evening to our guest lecturer, Elisabeth Povinelli, who is joining from Australian Central Standard Time Zone. I looked it up. And I welcome you all to the second event of the lecture series, Unsettled, Performance, Protection and Politics of Insecurity, hosted by the Hessian Theatre Academy. And that I had the joy and the honor to organize together with Bojana Kunst from Applied Theatre Studies in Giessen and Sandra Noeth from the Inter-University Center for Dance in Berlin. And as we did last week, where we had our first lecture, I will keep my introduction short in order to give enough space for the lecture and for our common discussion afterwards. And for the discussion, you can write your questions in the chat. We will ask you to do that, and we will pick them up and maybe ask you then to read them or rephrase them. But in order to keep the flow of the lecture alive, we will close now the chat and enable it as soon as the discussion starts. This lecture is going to be recorded and put on our channels and then also streamed during the regular time of the HTA Ringvorlesung at the 11th of November. So I welcome from the past, so to speak, the people who are going to join this event then next week and see this lecture then. So now I'm very happy to introduce Elisabeth Povinelli, our lecturer today, joining us from Darwin, Australia. Elisabeth Povinelli is a professor for anthropology at Columbia University in New York City, but she didn't come to Australia as an anthropologist doing field research. It was rather the opposite. She first arrived in the Northern Territories in 1984, if I got it correctly, as an undergraduate student of philosophy, and became an anthropologist at the request of the Beluen community, an indigenous community fighting against the neoliberal and neocolonial reorganization of indigenous life in Australia. So she was asked to become an anthropologist to help them in fighting against land acts and disappropriations. Until today, her work is rooted in the attempt to resist and unsettle neocolonial aims to dispossess indigenous communities and to absorb their patterns of existence or mode of existence into neoliberal politics of different. And she's doing this as a critical theorist who wrote an impressive series of books whose aim is to helping analyze settler late liberalism from the perspective of indigenous life forms and the impact it has on them. And so how settler colonialism is unsettling in a way modes of life, and how these modes of life are also trying to resist this. And these books, I think, touch a number of questions and themes that are important for this lecture series, for the theme we have, the importance of the body, but also always in relation to environments and more than human lives. Beth is also working as a filmmaker and member of the Carabing Film Collective, a collective from 30, 40 more people, I don't know exactly, from the Beluen community, who, I quote an interview, are less interested in making art than using film, media and art as means of altering the world. This double and very connected engagement of Beth is a very special feature, I think, of her work. And I started to engage with it last year, and it literally takes you into a journey into text, stories, images, and it's a very beautiful journey, I must say. So I'm very excited to get to know this work and to have you, of course, here. She's also working a bit at the intersection of these two projects with very visual and animated lectures that combine theoretical and political claims with somehow aesthetic elements. We saw yesterday with my seminar the lecture Melting Glaciers, Rising Seas, When I Am No Longer a Human Nor I Am a Fish, that you gave for Serpentine Gallery. You can see it on YouTube. It is a video lecture that is also a bit introducing themes that we are maybe also encountering today. And today she will talk to us about material from her current project, this inheritance project, telling us two different stories around the Povinelli clan and the Carabin clan. And I just give the word to you and welcome again. And we're very happy to have you here.
Thank you, bravo. That was, I wish everybody in Carabin was here, because that just, I think, really encapsulates the desire of the group. So thank you for that really wonderful introduction. And thanks everyone for coming in the various time zones that we're in. And for the organizers inviting me to try and help us all think through the thematic of the series of lectures, a thematic that's extraordinarily close to my heart, really, for me, summarizes the center of what I try and work on, try and think through. I thought I'd start today's talk, and it's, I have a lecture, but I'm going to try and talk as much as lecture, because then my head's not done like this. I thought I'd start by just noting something that we probably all have noticed, or many of us are engaged with. That is a series of projects that have emerged over the last, let's say, 10 years, could be longer, could be shorter. Many focused in Europe, and many under the broad rubric of artistic research. So for the last 10 years or so, we've seen a proliferation in Europe and outside of Europe of artistic research projects, but also just research projects within universities that are turning here, I think it's important, back to ancestral, environmental, and commoning projects as a means of encountering, changing, addressing, mitigating various climatic and environmental degradations within wherever folks are. So these projects are often very local. They are usually within the European context, directly or indirectly, usually fairly directly, engaging the long consequences of capitalism's effect on lands, whether from tourism, mass tourism, to monocultural agri-capitalism. Sometimes, but not usually, if we're sitting in Europe looking at these projects that are interested in remobilizing ancestral traditions, usually the idea of colonialism doesn't arise. So usually they're framed by an engagement with the effects of capitalism on the climate and the environment. But sometimes people engage the fact that if we're going to turn back to ancestral traditions, European ancestral traditions of environmental stewardship, of commoning, of environmental traditions with the more than human world, sometimes people do engage not merely colonialism as something that happened over there, in the various over there's, either in the Western Atlantic or in the Pacific or in Africa, and et cetera, but also attempt to try and think of the ways in which colonialism happened in Europe. Now, I'm not speaking how, say, Estonia was colonized, but rather how the processes of colonizing the Western Atlantic or the Atlantic and the Pacific had a back effect in Europe. that has a fairly direct relationship to the environmental and climatic problems being encountered there. So these projects, these artistic research projects, or just research projects that are saying, how do we go back to these traditions, sometimes pre-Christian, it depends how far back we can go, but pre-property traditions. How do we go back to our ancestral traditions, and either pastoral traditions or farming traditions or cheese making traditions or fishing traditions? How do we go back and learn from these traditions in the context of rising seas and et cetera? For example, alongside Mao Malona, Roberto Raffaetta, Ivo Povinelli, who's a different clan than mine, so we're related, but pretty far, and Luigi Coppola. With them, I'm working on a project that we're calling Ecology and the Ancestral Present. That moves from Puglia up to the Alps, where my Povinellis come from, a village up there, via Bologna and Venice. And in each of these places, there are active artistic and just research and practice projects that are engaging with local ancestral traditions that are themselves engaging with contemporary environmental climatic changes. For example, in Corrizzolo, where Povinellis come from, up in Trentino and the edge of the Dolomites, there's a project that's looking both at the attempt to rethink cheese production, renew old pastoral practices in the context of the melting Alps. And so the melting Alps, so the destruction of the ski economy and land speculation. So as the Alps are melting, everyone's looking and saying it's, at some point there's not going to be the ski economy that's made this area really wealthy. It's going to collapse. And so land speculators are coming in to think, okay, how do we get here? And then, so that this area of common pasturage is already closing down, even as this other economy is probably collapsing. In Venice, of course, we have Roberta has a project there where it's looking at like sea levels, cruise. We know the drill in Venice. And then in Puglia, Luigi and Casa della Agricoltura are again going back to these old, working with farmers. They're going back to these ancestral traditions that they're experimenting whether these older ways of crop cultivation, fishing, and environmental management could counter the spread of specific bacteria and parasites, which emerge from a very specific and now long history of monocultural agrocapitalism. I say all this because it is something that's really happening. It's happening in a lot of places. And all of these are looking to, they're like suddenly we're facing these serious climatic and environmental, obviously, listen to Glasgow. Well, don't listen to Glasgow, please. But they're trying to, okay, well, wait a minute, what did we do before, right? And then can we pull them in and redeploy them? What's, of course, important in what everyone is facing is that by the time, at least let's say in Europe, just for now, I'm being a little stereotypical, but this is a project we're working on, so let me be for a second. By the time all these spaces we're working in go back to do a kind of archaeology of their ancestors, the actual ecologies that we're in have been radically transformed, right? So both the more than human world, but also the humans, that our bodies are not literally our bodies are not the bodies that used to practice these, because the environment that constituted the bodies are not that environment anymore. Right. So, go back and try and make cheese. The biome is completely different. The microorganisms that make it, the European legislation that allows a percentage of microorganism per cheese unit, right? The cows that make the cheese are eating different grasses, right? So this entire environment, of course, has shifted by the time, and I want us to hear what I'm doing, by the time we go back to do it. And here, of course, one confronts something one knows, but it's hard to practice the knowledge, but one confronts that history is not a set of, it's not a temporal order. It's not tickety top. History is a series of sedimentations and differentially distributed sedimentations. Right. So that we can't think about going back because there is no back. Right. There's no back. There's the present. Now, that doesn't mean that I guess pause on that thought. Now, this Italian project, so the ecology and the ancestral present is really an Italian project. It's like the poor North, which is now the wealthy North, but so it used to be the poor South, and then the Alpine regions were extraordinarily poor until post-Second War, right? But this Italian project is itself just part of another project that includes my Caribbean colleagues, right? And that project is deeply related to the Italian project. And the second project, you can hear how it's related. The second project we call Heritability and the Ancestral Present. So if the first one is ecology and the ancestral present, the second one is, it could also be, quite frankly, ecology, heritability, and the ancestral present. But there's an emphasis on the problematic of heritability in the second one. This project, as Francesca said in the beginning, or alluded, like summed up nicely, I think, follows the roots, I like the roots, right? The roots, the ROUTES roots, the roots. The roots and the worlds, the human and more than human worlds, of two sets of clans, right? So as these clans are enclosed by the histories of colonialism and racism, which, pretty much are the same, like the same thing. And also how these different sets of clans are able to and do creatively refashion and reform and maneuver within this sedimented colonial history. So the two sets of clans are indeed, on the one hand, the two clans that I pick up through my father's mother and father from Corzolo. And so on the one hand, I'm a Semanats Povinelli. So Povinelli emerges as a nickname in like 1490, because there's an archive, and we can talk about this. It's the whole other thing. It's really interesting. So it's, you didn't have surnames then, but it emerges as a nickname in like 1490s or something. And then as a cognomen in 1570 something. And then the Povinellis, it becomes a surname, and then it splits into three clans in the very early 1700s, maybe the late 1600s. And so there's Zolots, Semanats, and Martels, Morlots. And then Povinelli, the Simonauts continue down through, the kind of, it's a patrilineal thing. And then on my grandmother's side, my father's mother's side, the Bartlett Ambrosies, who kind of have this basic same temporality of surname emergence and clan emergence, right? And so that on the one hand, and on the other hand, a set of Katabing clans, we don't, this clan is definitely a European word. So we would say now in Katabing, a number of Katabing Dulk, which is a Bochamol word, or in Emiangle, we say Tedouin, a number of Tedouin. So for instance, there are three Dulk Tedouin, same meaning, different language, include Dolk, which is a sea serpent, and Nunguri, which is a black snake, a freshwater black snake, and Muddy, which is a barramundi fish. And one of the things this project tries to actually do or show is, on the one hand, the kind of fate of these clans and their more than human worlds as colonialism enters their lands, right? Now, this might seem odd because colonialism, like the 1600s, there's a British, a Dutch ship that just skirts the western coast of Australia, heading to the spice lands, and really just is spit off the shore of Katabing coastlands. So by 1600, there's a ship over there, but settlers don't get to this area in Darwin until 1859, so quite late. But colonialism hits in a settler sense, 1788, when the first fleet landed Sydney. Okay, so you have a 1788, and then you have a 1860, 65, 69 up in Darwin. So we're used to saying, well, see, colonialism hits Australia, colonialism encompasses Australia. But the back formation of colonialism that hits the Alps is just as important to understand the way in which these clans are absorbed and able to be absorbed, and how they creatively maneuver within these histories of settler colonialism. So we can say colonialism hits the Alps around the exact same time that boat in 1600, I forget what it was, 15, I will have to look it up, is skirting the shores in Australia. What does that mean? It means that the effects of the plundering of the Spanish Americas hit Europe in the late 1500s through price inflation. And of course, it's Habsburg, it's the Spanish Habsburg, and Naples is part of the Habsburgian realm, right? So you have this direct link of wealth that, of course, one would have to have time to actually spell this all out. Other people have done more than enough to show the kinds of links, very technical links, between the wealth influx, price inflation, and the rise of the fueling of the Renaissance, mercantilism, all of that the wealth that we know sits behind the creation, not only of mercantile capitalism, but capitalism as such. And the property logics of that, we flow into the emergence of the very concepts that we hold most dear, or many people hold most dear, the rights of man, democracy, self-possession, et cetera, et cetera. So we can say colonialism hits Europe, right? It's just that Europe, and when I say Europe, the European diaspora, so the US, all of this, like the Anglo diaspora, in the Atlantic and Pacific, but also the rise of Europe as such. So don't think it's this Europe. No, it's the European diaspora in the back formation. We just like to say that that hit was good. It's like Hannah Arendt saying, whoa, the slaughter in the Americas was good because it gave rise to a new idea of the public. Right. In the Alps, where my clan is emerges, basically around this time, a little earlier, gets a second wave, you could say, of colonialism when Napoleon comes over the mountains. So the long effect of this accumulation, that is the accumulation of self-possession by dispossession, the fashioning of bodies as settled and full and accumulative and, heft based on the gutting and sucking of other people's bodies in the Atlantic and Pacific, comes over the Alps to Trentino in 1796, 1801. Napoleon comes over and he frees these little Alpine villages from their freedom, because those little Alpine villages had negotiated these things called Carta de Regula that allowed them to be autonomous and self-regulating, including deciding and holding on to common lands and having very specific relationships between humans and the more than human world. There were still property relations, but they were regulated by the villages themselves. So Napoleon comes over and he frees them from their feudal freedom, right? So you see this in Europe and the US, you see this waving of a very different form and rhythm and kind of colonialism and back colonial formation, as opposed to, say, in Australia, where it comes on shore. Why does this matter? Well, for a couple of reasons. The first is that the effects of these forms of colonialism differently impact these two different sets of clans in very straightforward ways. For instance, when Napoleon comes over, well, the first is that there's enough commotion that, these little villages get they're like semi-autonomous peasants, basically. But when Napoleon comes over, and that those waves of various kinds of democratic revolution, the English one, the French one, the long arm of these things, the 1850s, it's these rolling back and forths. The people that these revolutions are freeing from, the feudal, the church, the king, the everything, that what they're freeing subjects into proletarianism. So, think of like 101 Marx. So you get liberated into being a proletariat. And indeed, in my village, when it came over, these Carta de Regula are abolished. Land speculators immediately come up, start clear cutting the Pine Alps, and my village in particular, but Simonow's, Povinelli's in particular, and Ambrosi's become blade sharpeners for the mills, and then knife sharpeners. So they were the kind of humans who were addressed as a person whose destiny was to be free. Now, big critique of freedom, but whose destiny was to be emancipated into a truly free subject who could self-possess, thus could possess other things like land and objects, right? So you had to dispossess the common, but you were addressed as someone who had the destiny of being possessing, right? Not so with what happened in Australia, not so with what happened on the western shore of the Atlantic. Those people were not addressed as potential subjects of freedom, not even proletarianizable. So Glenn Coulthard, who's a Dene critical indigenous theorist, it's done a really wonderful book that addresses this. In particular, that is the different effects of the loss of commons in Europe and the loss of indigenous lands in Canada, well, what we call now Canada in the US. That is, one is dispossessed into proletarianism, the other is dispossessed into extermination. And thus we see in Australia, when the first settlers come in 1788, all the way up till 1860s and into the 1930s and 50s, that this invasion wasn't to liberate the men and women and kids in Australia into human freedom. It was rather understood, discussed, and practiced as eliminating them. That is, putting them back in their correct time period. Thus, the maneuverability of these two different sets of clans are quite different, right? Once proletarianized, my clan and could take advantage, they were dispossessed, but they were given the opportunity to take advantage of other people's dispossession. That is, my clan goes from the Alps over to Buffalo starting almost exactly at the same time that settlers are first arriving in Darwin. So the first lot of Seminoles goes over to Seneca lands, which is now called Buffalo, New York, in 1870. Darwin is settled in 1859, 1860, right? And you see the difference between these kind of sedimented and strategic ways of maneuvering. Fine, we're not a clan, we're proletarianized, we'll take advantage, right, of this. I'm saying all this because I think, although you guys haven't really quite seen the films yet, really trying to grapple with the differential effects of not colonialism writ large, and the ancestral writ large, right? Let's go back to our ancestors, but rather, even in the case of someone like me who can say, like, oh no, I know exactly where I come from since 1492. And I even have a clan, which, maybe in your ears seems a little like, I don't know, but someone like me who could say, and it was not the other thing, not national. These were not national spaces up there. It was very village based, right? So they're capifamilia, and they were self-organizing, right? So it was in an empire, or various empires, but not. It was in it, but not of it, in their own self-reckoning. But those kind of superficial or too large categories don't capture the way in which colonialism itself is a series of processes of sedimentation of substances and values, the creation of the different possibilities of different sorts of bodies, different addresses to different kind of bodies, to be unsettled in different ways. So my family was unsettled, but that unsettledness was part in process, I don't know what the phrase is, of the way in which we are able to accumulate value, right? Movement and unsettledness was a strategic mode of advancing if you were addressed as white or European. Being unsettled if you were a member of Cotabine clans was a very, and being unsettled in the context of settler colonialism across Australia, but certainly in the North, often took the form of being settled, right? So that from the 8 was, as my family unsettled, right, is dispossessed, but given the power to take advantage of the dispossession of the Seneca. In the North, from the 1870s, same time, 1870s through the 50s and ongoing, indigenous groups were being either explicitly massacred, poisoned, lands were being fenced, and increasingly, and then during the Second World War, in a really final push, families and groups were forcibly round up and put into what were considered internment camps. Some of the internment camps were run by various churches and missionaries, others by the state. So Bellewen, where the Katabing are by and large live now, and where everybody was born and grew up, was originally the de Lissaville settlement, and it was a government constituted internment camp, in which all the folks living on the beaches that stretched down to their traditional lands and up to the Cox Peninsula, where Bellewen is, which is on the other side of Darwin, were all forcibly put on inside the camp, and their personal and intimate relations were regulated. Their work was regulated. Their rations were regulated. It was all regulated, right? And at the same time, during the same period, there was a program designed to literally, and I apologize, it is a horrible thing to say, and but it is what they said, which is to breed out indigeneity. So anyone who had even any white blood in them, the government had the power to take the child, put them in another kind of camp, and regulate who they married. And then they regulate who they're married. And there were these like charts showing how in 4 generations you could just get rid of indigenous people. Right? So when we're talking about unsettled or settled, it really depends on for which that movement or motion, for whom and for what that motion or settling is intended. How are we doing? There's a couple other things I could say, but I want to leave enough time for questions.
We can have another, I don't know, 5-10 minutes, and then we go into discussion.
Good. So when I started, I said, there are these projects that in Europe and really in the European diaspora, in which a lot of folks are trying to say, what were our traditions? What were our ways of doing things? Could we remobilize them, right? And then I said, oh yeah, and that project fits within this larger project, looking at it's not a comparative project. It's really, it's a circulatory sedimentary project. It's like, if you look at this point in history and this point of history and this point of history, how does colonialism change the form and the movement and the possibilities of bodies and humans in more than human world? Although I started like that, that's somewhat of a false narrative, a false way of putting it, because in fact, the Italian project has emerged from, at least for me, my part in it, has emerged from these 38 years working alongside my Bellewen colleagues and now Katabing. And I think this is important for three reasons. The first, it really is from the point of view of my indigenous colleagues and our work together that the notion of the ancestral present emerges. So if you remember the titles of these projects, it's Ecology and the Ancestral Present. It's Heritability and the Ancestral Present. And that emphasis on the ancestral present, I think, is extraordinarily important, especially when we begin to think about the way in which in characterizing what you're doing, you hold in place or displace an ordering of the world, both the world really writ large, like existence, and the world writ in a smaller way, that is holding up or shaking an order of social relations. For the Karabing, there isn't an ancestral past. Right? What could that possibly mean? Because, you know, there are ancestors in the land. We go out and they're there, right? And the land itself is, and they're human ancestors. So they go back into the ground, but they're there. And then they're also, the ground itself was human ancestors, right? So literally the geography is the shape of, and was shaped by various actions of different, now here again, clans, Dulk, Teruin, right? So if you remember, I said, oh, I'm a Semanot's clan. And we're going to also be looking at, what do we say? Clans of Karabing? If we don't say clans of Karabing, if we say we're going to look at the trajectory and the sedimentation and the struggle of Karabing human and more than human worlds, then we're really talking about the way in which the land was formed by, say, Dolk, which is the sea serpent. And the sea serpent did this thing with this other crew. I won't tell you what it is, but they did this thing, and then this other thing happened, and in the happening, they literally geomorphed the earth. And that's just one story. And Black Snake did this other thing. And if you know how to look, you know what, you can see it. It's right there. You can actually drink water from it, right? And all of them literally shaped the waterways, the coastal region, the wind, the air, right? And they were the first of then a family that then the next family, next family. So the thinking of the ancestral is not to think in the past. Of course, yeah, we know people were born and things happen in the past, but you're not thinking in the past. You're not looking at it as, oh, what was, you know, you're walking on the past. You are with it, right? You're drinking it. And this is the second thing, as whatever you're doing, in the second point, whatever you're doing to leave as the present past. If if you dump oil in there, then that oil is a relative of that ancestor, not past, but present. We don't even know what to say anymore, but the present. Like we say, it's right there, right? This reef, which is this barramundi fish, isn't in the past. Rex was here. Isn't it in the past? It's just right there. Can't you see it? It's right here, right? And this is the third point that I think is super important if we're going to think about bodies unsettled, or how we engage in this moment in which finally, probably for everyone, the consequences of history, not as a series of times, but a series of sedimentations, is coming home, as we say. For Karabing, there isn't a looking into the past now, like, oh no, what do we do now? What we should look in the past. What instead, like their parents and their parents and their parents, since that, you know, maybe since 1860, but the effects of even that boat that skirted by the shore of Western Australia. We don't know what effect that was. That the disease trajectory that set off the blowflies that in mermaids, when you watch, you'll see, and then set off the blowflies for the first time and devastated the country. Was that Dutchman the one that set it off first? Right. That's 1600s. Since then, it hasn't been forgotten. The past isn't forgotten, that you go back to it. Instead, the ancestral is the present. It's the obligations we continually hold, that we try and find a creative means of maintaining for keeping our human and more than human relations, all of which have a particular form, with them, to keep them in place, to keep them in their form, and with them to find new strategies of continuing, even when the environment is changing under our feet, which for the Karabing has been, since settler colonialism, a constant in their lives. It has never been, there's never been a moment in which they could think, oh, life is fantastic. The land and we are going in the right direction. The boats are heading toward the horizon. That's what colonialism gave to Europe. And thus Europe looks back and tries to find either their own traditions or someone else to save them. Karabing never was given that delusion. And so, like they have always, still now, they creatively go forward. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That was a very, very intense and very rich lecture you gave that addressed a lot of issues that I think are important for us. Also, we were discussing yesterday in the seminar. I start a bit so that people have time to formulate their questions.
Yeah. I have the unfortunate thing of everyone just stops talking. So think.
And we were actually, we saw this video lecture you gave, and then we were asking ourselves, how do we translate your experience and what is happening with the Karabing for European context, where we, at least me or many also in the seminar, are born into concrete cities, as it's also in the video lecture, in places where this ancestrality is also a bit erased or is difficult to reach back to these traditions. But as you pointed out now, is this concept of the ancestral present, that in a way also in these contexts, and also for the Karabing, also this ancestrality is never a clean, pure culture to draw on, but it's always a creative process and to take on. And it was also interesting because you termed this one term of our series is also protection, and you were addressing this in terms of maintenance, where you could say maybe protection is also an ambivalent term, as you made it with settling, unsettling, that I found also very interesting, that colonialism is an unsettling process that unsettles, the Povinelli and the Karabing in very different ways, but is also forced to settle, to push people in lands, in identities, in categories. So that this settling is also very, in settler colonialism, shows this also problem. And maybe the same can hold for protection, that is also an ambivalent term, because also these camps in a way are protecting, indigenous people, but in a way they're taking them apart. And, so maintenance, I think, is a very interesting term to talk about. And maybe you can tell a bit more about this practice of maintenance as dealing with this ancestral presence, with these sediments, that we have, and how.
I think that's really, thank you. That's really thoughtful and helpful. One of the things that we in Codabing, we all really think about and talk about, both just in an ordinary way, but also in the context of our film practice, is of course the way folks' words enter into this kind of funhouse mirror of settler governance. So, like, maintaining, keeping in place, and often interpreted as a kind of dull repetition. Oh, they're just about repeating, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that in some ways is because of the temporal imaginary of going back to our ancestral tradition, right? But in Codabing, one of the things that or their parents and their parents' parents, is that to keep something in place in the context of the kind of unsettling that settler colonialism is, and racial settler colonialism, obviously, is there's nothing more creative than that. We use, we use the word clever person too, like it's a very ubiquitous word in kind of English translated way. Delbrek is what we say in Emmy and Wajigan. And it means a person who can figure out how to piece it together, right? Really, it's like this incredible patterning mind that it's like, and once they show you, you're like, oh my God, you're right. So it's there in front of you. You can see it, right? And what Delbrek are still able to do is to figure out how, in this context, one can continue whatever it is, X, Y, or Z. How can we continue to belong to, say, when everyone got locked up in Delisville, which is now Belleau, how can we stay connected to our lands in the South? Because people would come up and down, and like you'd go down your lands and you'd be with your ancestors, you'd be with your dreamings down there, and then you'd come up and you'd be with them here. So it was this movement of, because everything's jealous, so you have to keep on going and like make your ancestors happy, or they're going to punish you. So it was really like, how are we going to do this? They've locked us up.
Yeah.
They if you tried to bust out, they'd pick you up and they'd throw you into the desert, where you had no relations, or so distant you didn't quite know how to find them. And so they came, these really amazing people. They used these underground tunnels it's a Kenby tunnel, but that already existed, right? Where these particular kind of more than human, non-human ancestors move, and they kind of reoriented ceremony around it. And then their sweat could go in there and it got shot back over there so that they could keep on communicating with their country during this whole period. So that's maintaining, right? And other people go, it's changed. Like when they went to court in 19, they were like in this court, and the government was like, oh, that's change. You lose, that's change. Because if you want to be recognized as an indigenous person, then you have to be frozen, right? So when we say maintenance, it's like that. Like, how do we keep the principles in place? Maybe you have to switch around the ceremony a little bit, but the underlying relations, the obligations to an understanding of your human and more than human relations remain intact, right? And again, this is very, very, very different than what goes on, say, like, if I want to go back to my village, I just need some money, that's all, which I don't have because it's very expensive, and I could go buy a house, right? No one's going to hold me to replicating, my Bartolotto Ambrosi or my Simone Povinelli's traditions, and which Prof did we have, where were we the cheesemaker? They're not going to say that. They're not going to even ask me if I know. So, and this is all that racial schemata in which some people can have their traditions, and this is the other problem with the Europe. We can have our traditions and the future, but some people can't have, like, if they try and maneuver like this, and they're said, oh, you're not real anymore because you can only have the past, you can only be frozen, right? According to Settler. I don't think it's, hopefully this is addressing, but these are the kind of things that that's what we have to dig into. We can't just say, like, well, we once had a pre-Christian, or, we can't just say that, because too much is sedimented in, and that's not how we were addressed. That's not how it built up.
Yeah.
But we can do it, but we have to do it in this way, right? So that it might be, like, for me, it might be what I learned from my ancestors, my white ancestors, what I learned from that old Simonauts, and Angelo and Amelia, was I'm not obligated to maintaining my traditions. I'm obligated to help redirect the material sedimentations back to where they came from.
Yeah.
See what I mean?
Yeah. To in a way,
also
deconstruct and connect in a different way to the effects. Yeah.
Because if we just go back and say, well, Europe too, then we're also skirting, I think, the issue that it's almost like, well, I don't want to be held responsible, I'm going to go back and find my own traditions. It's like, we don't get that option.
Yeah.
I don't think we do. We can go back, but we can't go back like that.
Yeah. I think this is what, of course, this working together is also doing, that you are having with Karabing, and and in this connecting yourself with them. And but I give over to others which are kind of waiting to have their questions. So I first, Sandra.
Yeah, Beth, thank you very much. That was super enriching. I want to come back to something that you mentioned when giving validation to actually traditional, but also craftsmanship and practices. You were mentioning cheese making, food, and these kind of things. And in that context, you were saying that actually, how can we just go back, because the bodies are not at all the same anymore? And I couldn't agree more. So my question is, because also at the same time in, let's say, performance art, choreography, and so on, like body-based arts, there was huge discussions about reconstruction, revisiting, and so on. And I'm thinking from the perspective of the body, going back to these practices, what type of learning would it need, or what type of learning could that be? Other than, just imitating or trying to come to close as it has been done at a certain point in time.
Yeah, that's super, because like up in Trentino, so the Ivo Povinelli he's a different clan. And he's been the head of the Pro Loco up there, and it's, he has a lot of, because he doesn't want this to be like, okay, let's go back to the old dancing as the new tourist industry, because right. So what would you how do you, and it, like really interesting. I think these are really interesting. Like, how do you do it now? Like, how do you dance now? In the spirit of, right? In the spirit of what, like, how would I dance now in the spirit of my father's parents? Something like that. Like how, and in some ways, to be honest, I dance in the spirit of my grandparents, because the same kind of mad, stubborn, like, you know, what, this is all about surviving. Well, I danced that dance. And he was a kid in the First World War, and like, you know, what went on there. And it was very much, he put that in our bodies and we danced that. And with Ivo, he's working on this project to pull some land out, and it's not Corzolo, it's down a little bit, to create a new kind of common. But he doesn't want to go back and just say, okay, so, you know, and he was a kid in our village, you know, he's one of the kids that took the cows up. So he was still doing that.
I mean, I'm thinking,
I don't have a good answer. I think it's the right question. Like, or how do we dance in the concrete, right?
No, just thinking that maybe then dancing could even be more, you know, pushing even more towards the unsettled, rather than trying to stabilize or reconstruct. Yeah, you know, so that I think that is what I'm aiming at. So if we agree that bodies are, you know, kind of fragmented, I mean, that's not what he said, but let's say in the plural, and, you know, kind of made of different sediments, then maybe what artistic practice could bring is to work on the unsettled, rather trying on conserving or these kind of things. So I guess it's somewhere along the lines, but I'm happy to.
No. I think this is really, I have to tell you, I find this really interesting, because it's a place in which I don't know what to say. And I kind of like those places, right? So can I just say a little background in why all this started? Part of it was because we all started seeing, it's like this movement in artistic research, like with this, right? We all see it, and we all see also side by side it, the rise of these right fascist things, and we're like, oh, that's not what we, right? And we also all go, you know, we stand in solidarity with First Nation and Indigenous people. And we say all this together. And I think, I don't know what we're saying. I mean, because with my, you know, since 1984, like we work to get in those kids, each other, that the parents above us got it into us. We try and get into kids, and the little kids, that staying obligated to the ancestors is fun, vital, important, right? And like there are dance traditions, like they're in Kottabing, they're in many places, but in Kottabing we have there's a series of singing men, and you know, we still dance, and the men still dance, but the bodies have changed, right? So asthma, I mean, really serious, like, you know, it's like dance, but like nobody can dance that long anymore. Nobody can blow that much. And the purity, if we go with, and plus, so it's like, well, this, okay, how do we dance this now? Like, how do we dance this with diabetes? I don't know. Let's just give it let's try and find the form of this. You see what I mean? Try and find the form of this body. And maybe now it needs a little hip hop thing to it. Oh, you know, how do we keep it in place and dances, how do we keep it in place by not agreeing to this settler imaginary that the truth, the traditional is frozen? It's like, no, it's not. It's not brittle. It's not frozen. Right. So I think that's also, it's like, how do you dance on concrete? Like, seriously, there's a stomping thing, and you really like to try and stomp on even hard dirt, like it busts your back. So we bring in sand. How do you dance on concrete?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I have, Bojana is, and all the others feel free to, join the discussion, write a note, or,
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. That was really wonderful. I have so many thoughts. So I was thinking also what you said, what you were discussing, like how ancestralists in the present help us really to grasp also the difference between these populist and fascist moves and thinking about ancestry. For me, this is so important, this intervention, what you did, because it's conceptually also making us possible to differentiate what are we actually doing in the moment of the now. And I was thinking that actually really there is this this push in Europe, because I also follow this push very much also in parts of the Eastern Europe and so on. It is really also interesting to think in this way that it's also a kind of a very problematic consequences of colonial interventions into Europe and what happens now with the discourses about the past. And I was just thinking, I would like to just bring one more example into the discussion, because when I was listening to you also talking about clans in Alps and so on, I was thinking about this ancestral present in the territory of Balkan, for example, in the moment, because there was a war 20 years ago and new states are now there. And now one of the main migration flows goes through this former war territory. And I was really thinking when I was listening to you, how we can observe there really these differential effects of colonization. And by example, that 20 years ago, when the war happened, there was still a chance for people to fly exactly because of that kind of history of Europe and the way, and also because people were still belonging to the possibility of hope, to the white people and so on. And now in the same woods, in the same territory, in the same landscapes, the people are stuck and they cannot go anywhere. And I was just thinking how these colonial differential effects are actually really destabilizing or really erasing the possibility of thinking, or even have a kind of a first thought that these people also have to be protected. Like what is, and it's so interesting how it changes also the whole natural and bio environment of that region. And I just want to bring this story on because it's very actual story. And it's really a story happening really now on the European Schengen borders. And it's interesting that a lot of those Schengen borders are located in the territories of Europe, which were always negotiating themselves inside these colonial stories, either on the east, either in the Mediterranean. So it's just maybe if you can tackle a little bit also that, it's I think it's very, very important.
Yeah, I do too. And really, it's one of the things that started me on this like clan thing. Like, you know, it's because I thought, well, okay, I actually can do this. I mean, there's a way in which the Simonons Povinellis lend themselves in this way. There's so much in your question. I'm going to just kind of tackle it in a couple different directions, and I probably will fail to tackle it at all, so I apologize. But I think the way I would like to begin to address it might seem at kind of this weird angle, but it's in what you said, which I think you said like the lack of hope or something, right? Did you say, yes? Yeah. Okay. And that's part of what, you know, that's part of, like, I'm just interested in all these shifting in the who gets to move, who doesn't get to move, the imaginaries of space. For instance, in the Balkans, say in the Balkans, but like throughout, we all know, you guys know, Americans don't know, but y'all know, the Ottoman Empire was Hungary. I mean, it was this whole region as mercantilism starts, right? And let's say the basic principle of mercantilism is do not export raw material, right? Only export value added, because that's how you stay ahead of the game. And as a result, and the way the economy is set up back then, that was the game. And as a result, what everyone wanted to do was to just go plunder. So everyone wants a colony so they can plunder the raw material. Then they manufacture it, either that, the trade manufacturing, and then they export value added. And I forgot to mention, but let's just remember that as Napoleon is liberating my area, he's crushing the Haitian Revolution. So the rights of man, of course, are certain kinds of faces, right? So this whole area is completely, it's just completely destabilized. And I grew up with this history of, Elizabeth, you got to be careful. You never know when they're going to come over the hills. And, we were in Louisiana, it was like flat. I was like, there's no hills here. No, they can come from anywhere, because it was just this passed down, like the radical instability here, the movement, the forced movements of the religious wars, like the expulsions, all of this, right? All of this is happening. But there was if you were white, if you were part of the European diaspora in Europe, or I call it European diaspora, but it kind of is, or like the Americas, Australia, wherever, these sedimented, redistributed materials like Brussels is Congo, right? Pound for pound, like Congo should say, plant its flag in Brussels, because Congo was strip mined, right? And the toxic tailings left behind. So pound for pound, right? But there was this idea that, we're going somewhere, right? There's a horizon, the future, right? Oh, right. And it was literalized, like, we can move. My family could move. And I think what's happening now, and this is also what's happening now, of course, is suddenly the horizon is dark, right? And the horizon was where, like, this history of liberalism and democracy could always either justify or excuse its own violence. Massacres of Indigenous people and Australians, we're just getting time in order. The Stone Age people are being put where they belong, so we can move forward. We made a mistake, so sorry, our boats are going in the right direction. Aka Habermas, right? So the horizon is where you could always adjust, but certain people got to go, while others were frozen in the past, right? Are you repeating or not? And with that horizon, suddenly people looking at the horizon, these people are looking at the horizon and they see a storm cloud, they see rising tides, they suddenly feel locked in, right? And try and lock out. Right? And this too is interesting to me, because what's the difference between those who see a coming catastrophe, right, over the Balkans, right, over the oceans, the rising sea, and those for whom this has been an ancestral catastrophe, right, which by this point, hopefully we've all heard that phrase now. And it's part of what I was suggesting when it's always been an ancestral catastrophe, then what you're doing is trying to figure out how to keep it in place. How do we just keep going? How do we keep keeping this in place? Who is allied with this to keep it in place? Which is not repeating, right? Versus those who now say, oh my God, it's happening to us. Let's go back to the past. And it's like, it's been happening, right? So all these things, it's not, again, I'm not giving answers. I just think that's why I love this, the program you guys are putting on, because I think it's the right questions that we don't quite know how to, but I do think we're seeing the effects of what happens when not only certain people who have benefited from this horizon and from the distribution of the toxic results, like the tailings, leave them there and we'll take the good stuff. When not only they know that's gone, finished now, like you can't do that anymore, and it wasn't true anyways. It's a double whammy. That's why I think anti-colonial critique, I think Black critique has been effective. I also think it's why a lot of people are like fascists, for instance. You could say, the rise of white nationalism, or what do we call it? Yeah, white nationalism. What's it called? Can't remember. Well, not primitive. Yeah, there's a variety of it. It's really interesting. Some would say it's left, some would say right. But white nativism, the rise of white nativism, we could say we could despair, or we could say, actually, white nativism is the best sign that anti-white supremacy and decolonizing critique is working. Why? Because suddenly it's not enough just to be white, like, right? You like, oh wait, you have to have your own traditions. So there's a way, and so it's like this, remember the Counter-Reformation? So up in Trent, right? So it's like a white cultural Counter-Reformation. So the rise of Lutheranism, Protestantism forces the Catholics to go back, change in order to maintain their power. And there's a way, I think, and this is another reason I'm saying, yes, we should all really try and think of how to dance in concrete, or dance in wherever we are. But we have to be very careful how we do it, because we don't want to lend our energy to this cultural Counter-Reformation in which, now we have our traditions too, and they're rooted, right? And therefore you stay out after we stole everything from you, so it's just, yeah. Sorry, I can go on and on.
But thank you a lot. Yeah.
It's a lot. Yeah. I would very much like to invite the others to join, just jump in, and
yeah.
I can see you all now, have my full screen, so just feel
don't be
free
shy.
and very welcome to join the discussion, have your questions.
Are y'all the students? I see. Is that Martina? Yeah, hi. I can't see everybody. I can only see this one little strip.
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. It was wonderful to listen. And I think that this notion of the ancestral present is really like raising a lot of thoughts and images in my mind. It's a wonderful notion, I think, because also it's immediately somehow relativizing every thought in the direction of individualism if I perceive myself as a sedimentation of an ancestral past, or I think it's a very nice notion to think with. But at the same time, now I was asking myself that if I'm considering the ecological catastrophes we are facing now, and I think about them as a kind of effect of, or if I think about them as a kind of ancestral present.
That's right.
I have primarily associations that go back to the people in my family in the past or in my cultural context, etc. And I'm wondering, because I think somehow I was a lot thinking about the role that capitalism has in producing these kinds of ecological effects. And can I think capitalism as an ancestral present? Like I'm asking myself how I could.
Right. I maybe a way of, I don't mean this to be individualizing at all. Right. So by the ancestral present, I certainly don't mean like each of us, but that sedimentation is as I say, where'd you go? There you are. Sedimentation is a distribution of materiality. So even if we just think if I think in a very simplistic way, and I mentioned Brussels, you think of the way in which Brussels is formed by the deformation of Congo. And it's in that deformation and formation is also initially a more, and still a differently intensified toxicity. So although eventually now there's a global ecological thing, still now it will be felt more and differently in the Congo, where as you separated out various materialities, you left behind the toxic tailings, the gutted earth, etc. Right. So when I think like this, I think about that kind of movement, like, right. So capitalism is part of the ancestral present, right? So say in I said, for instance, like by the time we're going back to pastoral practices in the Alps or cheese making or all these things, the very ecology in the bodies, both cows and humans, are materially not the same as the people who are practicing and making the cheese with other kind of bodies. Like the biome's different completely, micro everything. So too in Australia, by the time last year we had recycled, it's a long story, but we counterflow money from the art. So we just strip the money it makes to make the films out of me, but because this is an accumulation machine. And then we use the money we making the films to do land-based stuff and dance-based stuff and stuff. So we don't make money from films to make films, because that would be ridiculous. So one of the things we did is we bought a bunch of trucks and we bushwhacked this road to this area where a lot of the dreamings are. The dolk is there, the muddy is there, they're all down there. And this project's been going on for, like, I can't tell you, I mean, since I've been there, I mean, how to get back, like, you know, they rounded up everyone and turned them how to get back, right? By the time we got back, you know, the seas have risen, they're more acidic, the wetlands are different, there's pigs and cows over there. So there's all kinds of changes that have happened, right? And that's capitalism. All of this is capitalism. Europe is a sedimentation of capitalism. So when you go to do your ancestral present in Europe, it's the sedimentations of capitalism, but so in Australia is the sedimentations of capitalism, right? So we're all in the sedimentations of capitalism. But the way in which capitalism and its liberal foundations, or illiberal in some places, addresses us radically different and radically differently, right? And I always use the Napoleon over the Alps versus the settlers into Darwin as a good example because, the Napoleon over the Alps and the settlers into Botany Bay, or the Seminots go to Buffalo and Darwin settled. I use those two because you see how, although everybody is within the sedimentations of capitalism and then the sediments keep sedimenting, how we're addressed and thus how the roots and worlds we're able to make for like all these many years very differently, right? Very, like, our bodies are completely different. I am not plagued by diabetes, right? In Cotabing, I'm going to be 60 in February. In Cotabing, the only person older than me is Posey, who I call sister, and she's 65 now. That is the sedimentations of settler capitalism right there. Okay. That is outrageous. And we all say, like, we should have old people. That's what I mean. Right. And so absolutely, you're right. We live we're in capitalism's ancestral present, but we're addressed by it differently. How do we use how we're addressed by settler capitalism and its ancestral sedimentations? How do we not just simply say, which I'm not saying anybody is, but how do we really say, okay, I understand where I'm situated here. So maybe the answer is not for me to be obsessed with myself, but to understand that my job is to help try and redirect away from myself. This guy, I'm sure you guys know, Edouard Glissant, who was one of the many brilliant people that come out of the Caribbean, and in this case, Martinique. And, you know, in his Poetics of Relations, he starts it in the hull of a slave ship. And he says in that hull in the mid-Atlantic, 3 abysses open up, or 3 relations. One between the African shore, they'll never go back, and one, the American shore, they may never reach because, you know, white slavers would just throw people overboard, or the death rate inside the ships were, of course, just horrendous. And then there was the abyss of the sea, right? And then the sky. So he talks about the Poetics of Relation is these relations opened out of this boat. How do we relate to those relations? This really, Martina, this really great question you have. How do we relate to those relations? Do we relate in either those are my ancestors? Well, not my ancestors, but like if you're a Black American, those are my ancestors, right? Those are your ancestors, right? And so the sedimentations of all that. Do I relate by saying, I wasn't there, I was still in my village? No, because my village was already accumulating all this value in this way, I'm saying. So colonialism is happening like that over there. So I didn't have to be in America. I didn't have to be on the boat, right? Nor am I guilty. That's not the point. the point is that how am I related to that? It shouldn't be through empathy. Oh, I feel sorry for people. That's nothing. What is that? Instead, it's like, oh, I'm related through this history of sedimented accumulation. And I don't mean me, I mean we. And therefore, my relation to that ship has to be on the side of trying to alter the flow.
Yeah, thank you very much for this great answer. I
think, oh yeah, sorry, yeah, we got to stop.
No,
great
well,
question,
I would like to continue, but I think we are slow. I don't see also further questions, but I think it was very important to address, this, I mean, with this question, the sediment, so that that capitalism, is an ancestral presence, that this sediment are all over, but address people very differently throughout their life expectations and so on. So really within the bodies, but also this aspect of relationality and seeing all these very different aspects when we talk about capitalism. So not that you were also saying, not with the bold C, but to see all these kind of different stories that are complex and the relation between them, and to look very close and then to see where we can redirect them, where we can reconnect relations in a different way and escape, these effects.
That's the dancing in a different way.
Yeah.
That's the different dance.
Yeah.
I think. You guys, thank you.
Thank you very much. That was great to have you with us. That was very rich and very good. Thanks to everyone for joining this morning and listening and being here. So we close this lecture for today. We will meet again for the next. And I wish you all a good day and good evening. Thank you for enduring with us, although it's later for you. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you, guys.